Before I give you just a very short overview of what is happening in Belarus, may I also thank Olesa Mincheniuk as director of the Ukrainian Institute in London and her colleagues for organizing this very important and timely event, and to all the attendees who gathered here today for the discussion. We will take probably about 30 minutes with all our presentations, or possibly a little bit more, in order then to have discussion also between the speakers, and then we will open the floor to question and answer. So, moving on then to shine some light on what is happening now in Belarus. We all know that on the 9th of August, Belarusians went to the polls to vote for a new president. However, the signs of state meddling were already apparent prior to the election, with illegal arrests and pre-trial detentions of many political activists, including, of course, two presidential candidates, Sergei Tikhanovsky and Viktor Babarika, and also barring of Valery Tsepkalo from participation in the elections, who subsequently fled the country. What wasn't expected, including, of course, by the authorities themselves, is the rise of these three amazing women to stand up to the regime. That is Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who became subsequently a registered candidate, Maria Kolesnikova, who was heading the campaign for Babarika, and also Veronika Tsepkalo. They managed to ignite and unite around themselves millions of people. It was absolutely unprecedented how they brought it out in the Belarusians, a sense of pride and a sense of self-worth, which actually laid the foundation for the protest movement thereafter. So, post-election, of course, the Central Election Commission announced the results as follows. Turnout was about 85%, which was very high, with Lukashenko being declared a winning candidate at 80%, and Svetlana Tikhanovskaya was coming as 10%. These cynical and blatant lies were confronted by exit polls organized through various IT platforms, but also witnesses at various voting stations, which actually reported that Svetlana Tikhanovskaya allegedly obtained not 10%, but 95%. And yet the Central Election Commission declared Lukashenko the winner, though election results were not recognized by international community. What happened after was absolutely shocking. Not only did Lukashenko blatantly steal people's vote, he also unleashed on them absolutely unprecedented violence associated with intimidation, beatings, torture, disappearances, and even murder. Murder of peaceful, absolutely peaceful protesters. Every basic human rights convention has been broken according to international law. In the recent press conference, Pavel Latushka reported that there were over 10,000 arrested. I guess this figure is much higher today. However, only about 500 people managed to report their injuries, being subsequently fined for participation in so-called unsanctioned peaceful meetings. We are now looking into the 5th week of peaceful protests that bring together people from every walk of life. We have students, we have workers, we have professionals, we have teachers, medical staff, pensioners. The symbol of Belarusian movement today is actually the very image of Nina Baginska, the old lady who is going for a walk every time with a Belarusian flag, absolutely undefeated and undeterred by anything there. People formed a coordination council as a result, with over 100 members there, and its presidium of 7. There is only one member presently remains free, and we don't know for how long. It is a Literature Nobel laureate, Svetlana Alexievich. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, Olga Kovalkova, Sergei Dulevsky, Pavel Latushka, they were all forcibly removed from the country. Maxim Znak is being arrested, or is currently arrested. And Maria Kolesnikova is still missing, being detained in an unknown location. This is where we are today. So let's invite our speakers to give us a bit more detail about the very nature of what is happening in Belarus, and especially about the protests, because the questions we are all asked today: how long this will continue? Will people eventually, due to bad weather perhaps, or violence or abuse, will eventually stop and everything will go back to normal? And I guess our speakers will tell us today what are we possibly to expect, if anything, in the next few days, because the future is very uncertain about Belarus, and potential ways forward. So Alena, let's begin perhaps with you. Given that we saw protests in Belarus, or we see protests in Belarus, in fact, almost every 5 years, going back to 2006, of course, perhaps one of the biggest, and then 2010, and even in 15. And yet, understandably, 2020 seems absolutely different. So, given that you were there, you saw it all in action a few days ago, what do you think makes it so different? What do you think make it stand out? And what's your impression when you saw the people? Are they likely to basically, to step down, go back home and watch it from their sofas? What will happen next?
Thank you, Elena, for this introduction, and of course, thank you, the Ukrainian Institute, for organizing the whole event. Yeah, I would like to share my observations and the ideas that I really have a lot of ideas, but I would focus on the most fascinating for me and most inspiring. And of course, I first of all engaged with these protests as a citizen, I should say. When I was there, it was not possible to function as a researcher, and I didn't even try to do it because it was so close to my heart and really experience it to the bone, I would say. So what makes it special, if to answer this question, I really want to come back and emphasize again what Elena, you said about this level of violence, state violence, that was totally disproportional. And I think we really, to understand the protest, we have to start from this point. Because if we see the state as sort of the state has this monopoly for violence, anyway, somehow this violence can be rationalized, or people have to understand why state use this or that measures. And in this case, it was totally, people were not capable of grasping why they are met with this sort of violence. I should say that I would share my observation not only from Minsk, but also from a little industrial provincial town, Zhodino. Mm-hmm. This is the town there my parents live, and this is also the town there, the industrial plant Belarus, the factory that produced these heavy trucks, dump trucks, located, and the factory that tried to go on strike, one of the first. So what happened was that for Zhodino, it was totally unexpected that the special police forces will appear and start to detain people. And there are many stories how workers who were just coming home from night shifts were detained, And it's important, all these stories circulate, and this is how this feeling of terror is really alive and yeah, so that's actually was the trigger, very strong trigger for protests. And what makes this protests special, that just to counter this extreme violence, the protesters are very consciously choose and continue choosing their peaceful way of counteracting, of protesting, and that fascinates me a lot. Like this, I also have my observation there when I were part of some informal meeting where local community decided to put faces on some sort of unknown telegram nicks, and we met, and a girl turned out who was a little drunk, and all other people asked her to leave because she was compromising the meeting, this very high this, I don't know, the whole meeting was really like a sacred place because we were planning something very important, and we have to kind of reach this level of being very, very particular in who we are and how we behave. So there's small gestures that really shows that people are scrupulous in how they follow the rules and how they behave to really portray the idea of peaceful and conscious citizen, not some sort of how they portrayed in official media. Another important features of this protest is that, as you might already guess from my description, is that it's also engaged a lot of cities, towns that are never ever before had any history of recent history of protest. It's very, very interesting to observe, and that's very inspiring, that region also reason. And why it become possible? It's also important question, why this mass mobilization is happening. And I think that it's partially due to there are so many forms of protest that are now available for people. So there are so many entry points, and people are encouraged, if they are afraid to protest in the streets, they are invited to print out some leaflets and just to disseminate some information among neighbors. And it's also very, very interesting that people are explicitly told, the message are circulated, that that everything is important. There is no something, that there is no minor thing. Everything that people can do is welcomed. And another aspect that I would like to point out is that the protest is decentralized, is very much dispersed, and it's really interesting to observe how different places, different location in Minsk work. Like there is a certain address, like people all know that there are some streets, then there is a graffiti, and basically the way how they stage the protest is basically to keeping this graffiti on, yeah, because some how you call this person come and try to paint it, cover the graffiti with the paint, but then the local inhabitant come and just to wipe away the paint, so the graffiti stays. And so that's all the flag waving. This is the whole, this symbolic way to claim that this is our place, and we exist here, and this is who we are.
The act of defiance as well. Yeah.
So that's a localized and very interesting way of, like, symbolic way of protesting is also very interesting. And maybe my last point will be that this protest is also very inclusive, in a way that it's really a window of opportunity for many different groups. And I personally was involved with some feminist, and I've noticed a lot of slogans that are kind of advancing this agenda, but also you might already seen in the picture that during the last march on Saturday was a LGBT column. So I really should say that it's very unique and special for this protest, because before what I was observing that people were not really friendly to LGBT community to appear. And here there's something very interesting to see that protesters try to frame the protest as really inclusive and invite a diversity and and not to avoid the conflict, like what kind of ideology we have. So that's also very important. So maybe I will stop here because I'm sure that Nadzeya would like to jump in. And,
Absolutely, but before we go to Nadzeya, may I just ask you perhaps one or two questions, just picking up on what you've said. Well, first of all, of course, you said that the level of violence was absolutely disproportionate. Why do you think this is the case? After all, you know, the protesters, now the Thieves' Week into the protests, they show it that they're peaceful and they're absolutely unarmed. They come out there with balloons, flowers, and songs. Why? Why such a disproportionate response on the part of the authorities?
It's very hard for me, but I'm thinking they sort of use the old schemas, how they work. I think they perceive the protesters and the protest as some sort of a hierarchical structure. That's why they targeted so-called the leaders. And the assumption was that if the leaders will be imprisoned, the protest will be sort of beheaded, and it would be very shallow. And also this was the hierarchical and patriarchal, of course, view on protesters and protests. But then the protesters still show up, and then they decided we have to scare them away, because before it works, if we remember 2006 or 2010, after brutality of the police, the protester didn't appear again. And here somehow, maybe because of already the maturity of the society in a way, or this really, like, there's this moral shock. The violence was too much. It was really, you can't explain it. It wasn't just the opposition that sort of you get used to the stories that some sort of the members of opposition was beaten up because it's sort of their karma, or how sort of the deal again. You are the opposition and we are the state and we are persecuting you. But there was a really, like I
don't know, maybe people didn't have anything to lose but their dignity now, and dignity was the last thing that they're unwilling to sacrifice in that case.
It's also, of course, it's also a lot about this, what people are saying now. People were offended by all sorts of names that they are called by the president.
Brats, for example, is one of them.
Yeah, and that's and the protest, of course, a lot to reclaim that they are not sheep, that they are not. There are a lot of banners and that saying we are not sheep, we are the people, or we are not.
And we are not little people, narodец. We are Belarusians from capital B, you're right. But there is another interesting feature which you kind of mentioned, but only in passing. But given your interest, I would be particularly keen to hear what you think about the female face of Belarusian protests, because it is absolutely amazing. You know, when I saw those 3 bright women in action before the election, it was so galvanizing. It was impossible to stop, and everyone united around them. And then you see how it is kind of like a ripple effect of it all, how women were coming out, and how actually, you know, the special forces were absolutely, you know, taken aback by the mass of women going against them. And raising their hand was obviously beyond imaginable. So could you comment literally a few words on that, given the nature of your interest?
Yes, unfortunately, they already found out the way how to raise the
intimidate, yeah.
women, and today and yesterday it was already, gender was not working in the same way. Yeah, but before, indeed, it was some sort of a break in the schema, who are the protesters and how we deal with protesters was broken for the law enforcement. But I would say that what make these three women powerful, that they were just were able to send this message that the unity is more important than the difference. And that just they were really not claiming the power. What also was very fascinating, like Tikhanovskaya from very beginning said that I don't need the power. And it was in a way tempting, because before we all had these men who were willing to fight for their power, and that's why they were not able to unite, because they all want to be the president.
Okay. Very fascinating. Thank you very much, Elena, for your comments, especially first-hand witness to all these protests, not only in Minsk, but of course in Rodina. Yeah. Now we are moving on to Nadzeya. Nadzeya, you work in the Amnesty International. You're exposed to, to kind of on a daily basis to various violations of human rights and against people in different parts of Eastern Europe and now in Belarus. So what do you find particularly shocking now in the case of Belarus, putting it either in comparative perspective or just looking at Belarus itself? How could, this violence be explained? I've already asked this question to Elena, but it is so brutal, so inhumane and almost inhuman in many ways. Behavior that we currently witness from the so-called siloviki, the strong man, but which actually very interesting through various platforms, they're called really slaboviki, which are the weak men who actually raise their hand on the people. So could you perhaps comment, say a few words on that? And of course, with your presentation, please go ahead as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's an honor to be part of this discussion, and I'm very glad that it's an all-female panel of participants. It's a pleasure, and I wanted to start and say that I am a researcher at Amnesty International, and I am a scholar. But as Alena already said, I kind of first of all feel as a citizen of Belarus and as a female-born citizen of Belarus, and probably that's why I wanted to share my observation. And because I have been observing it specifically as a woman, as a queer woman, and given my background, I think the role of women and the power of women is unprecedented. I want to probably talk a little bit about that before coming to the question of what will be next, what can be next. And when I was thinking about it, I thought that I wanted to talk about couple of things, and then we will see, maybe some things will be more interesting to discuss, or there will be questions about that. And I wanted to start a little bit earlier than elections, actually, if we're thinking about the mobilization of women, or why they suddenly, I don't believe that they suddenly became active. They have been active, obviously. But I remember myself, and actually in a way, distaste, I think, and shock, and many other emotions when I heard when Alexander Lukashenko went to visit Minsk tractor factory at the end of May, and it's already infamous phrase, but I will quote it, and I promise maybe that will be the last quote from Lukashenko. But we have to understand the background, and because women also respond directly to Lukashenko in many cases. So on 29th of May, in the run-up to the presidential election, he visited the factory and he said, "Our constitution is not made for a woman as president. Our society has not matured to vote for a woman, because according to our constitution, the president holds a strong power." End quote. And obviously, in a month's time, or at the end of in 2 months' time, he tried to remedy the situation and actually made it even worse, commenting on the constitution is such that even for a man, this presidency is a heavy burden, and if one placed it on a woman, she would collapse, poor thing. End of quote. And I think at that point, you could see that many women of different walks of lives, they responded in public statements, in media publication, in video clips. And I think that obviously there was not a big surprise that Lukashenko said it, because if we look in the history of his presidency, he has routinely made sexist remarks. He relegated women to, you know, beauty bodies. He relegated them to the domestic sphere, where they should, you know, give birth to as many children as possible, obviously, for the nation's sake, and rare children, and I'm quoting again, I'm sorry, preserving tradition and moral values, and end of quote, and I promise this is it. And then I think that this patriarchal, discriminatory, and very dismissal attitude was beyond the easiness with which Svetlana Tikhanovskaya was kind of, you know, was allowed to be registered as a candidate, because obviously who takes women seriously in a way. And I would even say that probably this is one of the reasons behind Lukashenko inevitable, I think, political demise would be the fact that he actually underestimated women and the power of women. And then, yes, I wanted to comment, I think the image of three women, as have been already mentioned, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, Veronika Tsepkalo, and Maria Kolesnikova, was very unexpected in a way. Nobody expected. It was almost accidental, you know, that that Svetlana Tikhanovskaya would be a candidate, and then I think it was also unexpected that they would actually unite. And I think this unprecedented political solidarity over competition, this is something that has never happened in Belarus, I think, in this way. And then it was a massive support from the population. So much for, you know, Lukashenko's comment that society has not matured enough, but we could see immediately the support, and tens of thousands of people come in Minsk, but also in Lida, Babruisk, Borisov, Zhodina, all smaller places. And I think what Alena said is very important here as well, that Svetlana from the very beginning said that decided in a way to run not for power, but for the change. And I think the shift of the focus from, you know, in a way, even from the idea of nation, but more to the idea of the people, you know, in a very post-nationalist rhetoric, but also the idea of just fairness, just being human and demanding fair election and the changes is very important here as well. I doubt that any man would do that, you know, in a way, give up the power of being president. And yeah, and going to the saying a few words, maybe not even a few, about women's protests, or I wanted to say that the first all female, or kind of specifically women's chain of solidarity appeared on 12th of August near the Komarovsky market in Minsk. It happened 4 days after the election. And I think what you said, Elena, and you, Alena, it was when the the brutality and the scale of the state violence became apparent. And we have to remember that the internet was down all these days, from like all these 3 or 4 days. So people literally probably even didn't know the scale and brutality, what happened, how many people were detained, what was happening, even though Telegram was, you know, kind of updating people. And I think that this is when women's chain of solidarity happened in this tipping point of a shock, in a way, that when this brutality and scale of the state violence became apparent. And I think maybe we can interpret it in various ways. One of them could be that it obviously was a statement of peacefulness, of non-violence, of solidarity, of support, but also perseverance in a way. I think at that point, and we discussed it with Elena today as well, maybe was the point when the state was like, yeah, we broke them, you know, that's it. After this crackdown, nothing will happen. And maybe women in a way reshaped the format of the protests. They kind of suggested that this is how we can still continue. And I think there was a shift in a way, because previously protests were happening in the night, during the nighttime, you know, but women came out during the day, like literally like in the morning. And then in a way, maybe they offered the form that would become a template in a way for the protest, you know, the peaceful, there maybe sometimes flowers or also white clothes or white color that was used by Tikhanovskaya before in her election campaign. But and also, yeah, they underscore the peacefulness, solidarity, support, and anti-violence. And I think what I also wanted to say, that obviously they just they have been part of other protests as well, general protests, not only women march, but since 12th of August, women marches also started happening. And it's fascinating, and I think it's just amazing, the slogans that women put on posters. And I wanted to share some of them. I will just read them, because I think they also say, they can say more than I can say about that. I will just comment afterwards. So for English speakers who listen to that, Sasha is a short for Alexander. So whenever Sasha is on my reading, it's Lukashenko. So we all are on the same page. So I just will read a couple of posters. Belarus is too good for you, Sasha. The division of housewives. So it's a group of women going. It's better to be an ordinary prostitute than the political one. I have 10 children and grandchildren. They must live in a free country. I'm not a poor thing and I won't collapse, but you will. Now Belarus know what domestic violence is. What would you do to a man who raped your sister, your brother? March of unsatisfied by dictatorship women. I have these days of the overthrow of dictatorship. Get your hands off our men. I came to the streets not for the men, but for the country. Sasha, I don't want you. Army, wash your own trousers. I'm a supermom. Get your dirty, bloody hands off my children. Belarusian revolution is made by women. Constitution has female gender. She is she. So just that gives you kind of a perspective. And I think I just want to comment a little bit, especially on domestic violence reference here, because, and I have to go back a little bit to Lukashenko's comment, but while commenting his decision not to give up on power, he compared Belarus to a loved one, Lubimaya, a dear one, and he said that one cannot let the loved one go, in a way. And we have to understand that there is no law on domestic violence in Belarus, which has been a discussion among activists. And I think this brought women to they just draw a parallel between the state violence and the domestic violence, were a very powerful one. and play around that. They also, I think, the audacity and courage of some comments who are referred to periods, to their sexualized bodies, to sex workers, to them being mothers. In many ways, it could be seen as reiteration of patriarchal stereotypes, but I think what they do, they in a way subvert a patriarchal stereotypes, and they claim their own agency, including including reclaiming control over their bodies and their sexuality in a way. And at the beginning, and like I know that's now not the case, which actually shows the escalation of the violence as well. Women were shielding men very often, and it was one of the tactics. So men would not be snatched in a way by the law enforcement or whoever is now the law enforcement. And obviously they were not spared. And we know that now that they have been also detained and arrested, and they've been among those who have been tortured. Yeah, and I think the last comment I would say, and I would go back to what Elena said, and I think this is also amazed me in a very good way, that over the last week, we can see LGBT, they have been part of the process all the way, obviously, but they revealed themselves as LGBT people explicitly, and we saw the queer section of the march with the rainbow flags. We saw slogans from pansexual, non-binary people, lesbians, and I think this inclusion is very important as well, the diversity of women across ages as well. You mentioned Elena, Nina Baginskaya, 73-year-old woman, but across ages, age, class, gender identity, and sexual orientation. And I think this is something that has never happened in Belarus.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you, Nadzeya. Very important points that you've raised here, kind of on the female face of the Belarusian protests, but also that defines their determination and their ingenuity in many ways. I think that also ignites and keep the protests going. What I was going to ask you, apart from the violence question, also perhaps why, this is something that I'm working on at the moment, something that we saw a little bit of in this Arab Spring, but then it was kind of dropped from the scholarly radar. But here, I think we actually see it emerging again. I can't remember, was it Alena or was it you, Nadzeya, who mentioned that you see it's something going beyond, something that unites people, but goes beyond nationhood. We are not talking about the kind of the emergence, the awakening of the nation here, not at all. What we are talking about actually very much the emergence of the peoplehood, which is far more powerful, far more inclusive, and far more unstoppable. And this is something that I think we should look at the phenomenon, because what Belarusians now bring into the world of resistance is something new, and something that we need to look at perhaps. So if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that actually, if we think that there is a word in Belarusian for that, and this word is tuteshe,
yeah,
which means we are the people who have been living here. And it actually goes back to what Elena said. They just reclaiming their place and space where they live, whether it's Chizhovka, Malinovka, Kamenная Gorka, Kamenная Gorka, our people close to my parents. So they reclaiming districts, places, villages, factories. And I think in a way, it's very, if we think about it, it's our phenomenon. I don't even want to use now Belarusian as a nation, but I think, yeah, this is fascinating. But we do have finally we do have a word that maybe English people, like English speaking people, don't have.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and something possibly to kind of to discuss it further with the audience. Okay, so being conscious of the time, perhaps now we can move actually to Nataliya. Nataliya, of course, is here also although kind of looking at the variety of different countries, but of course the Ukrainian perspective here is very important. So Nataliya, the floor is yours. And I just wonder whether, of course, there is a possibility whether, coming from your Ukrainian perspective, whether comparison actually here is applicable and justifiable, and if yes, what kind of parallels that we can possibly draw, or if not, then what is different?
Sure. Probably to start with, be very short on Ukraine and later very fast move to Belarus. I just should say that when we compare, there is a difference with what we compare, because I think still the perception of the Maidan in Ukraine is super different from the Ukrainians, from the people in post-Soviet space and the Westerners. Unfortunately, I should say that, of course, the Russian propaganda somehow succeeded in portraying Maidan as something violent or something with guys with a Molotov cocktail. So even when Svetlana Alexievich once mentioned in the very beginning that it's not a Maidan, I think like a bunch of the Ukrainians were really offended, because for the Ukrainian, the Maidan is first of all the peaceful protest, inclusive, where there would be females, LGBT, people from the villages, because prior to the, unfortunately, like the deaths of the people, we know there were 100 people killed, almost 86 people killed in the Maidan. For the first 3 months, the protests were peaceful, and they were more kind of street peaceful protest. So therefore there is a different perception, and somehow in the Western mind still Maidan maybe is still, and that's why I also am kind of very much disappointed that still in the Western perspective the pictures and photos of the guys throwing Molotov cocktails is the photo of the Maidan. For me, it's something very different. It's something which I experienced in Kamenная Gorka, when people gathered close to the, polling stations, in the Nezalezhnosti Square, or near the Stela, where the people tried to gather. And this feeling of unity, this feeling of where people would, when the drivers, cab drivers would horn to the protesters, where people would bring water. I've been also reporting on many other revolutions and peaceful protests. I've written a book on the Arab Spring, reporting from, Egypt, Tunisia, many other countries. That was my specialization. So I think there is some of the things we need to compare. But of course, coming back to Ukraine from Belarus, and also answering the question from Western journalist colleagues, they still asking me this: why the Belarusians do not gather in the square? Why they're not physically, use more force to defend themselves? Somehow with the tone I don't really like, because I think this is not the proper question. And what I'm trying to explain, that of course, since every revolution, since every mass protest, it's not just us, the scholars, the activists, but also the regimes learn how to oppose that. So of course, after the revolutions in Tahrir Square in Egypt, or in the Maidan in Ukraine, which is the closest to Belarus, of course, the Russian law enforcement, the Belarus law enforcement, they were preparing to not people get into the street, and it was extremely visible in the very beginning, in the first day of the elections, where it was just their task not let people to be somewhere together, not to have this feeling of unity. And I was very, let's say, saddened by the fact that before the police started to act, throwing the stun grenades, there were very little moment of this unity, unless the next days the people would be inspired and would have this feeling of the community. But somehow, therefore, I think there is no need for the people to gather on one square apart from Sundays, because the dictatorships today, they know, and especially having this physical force, as in Belarus, they know how to dismantle the protests. They just use, because if they are ready to use the tear gas and the stun grenades, as it was in Pushkinskaya and the second day of the protest, one of the most brutal days, yeah? Because, when you have a tear gas, you just run, you can't stand there. It was clear that it's easy to defend this protest with this type of state violence. Therefore, this tactics is just not necessary, because any kind of dismantling of any place would look as if it's a victory of the regime and the problem for the protesters. And with that, this fluid protest, this protest which is as a water everywhere, in different regions, in different towns, is somehow, there is no need for people in Belarus to get into one square. They need to show that they are everywhere. So it's just a different tactic. And I think it's very important somehow also remember also the fact that you do not need to stay there at night, especially mention that how brutal is the Belarusian police, that it's way more violent than the police in Russia, than the police I can compare to the police in some of the Arab states, in Tunisia, in Egypt. It's way more, I've been reporting from protests in Moscow, and it's way more brutal. So that would be my point, that we shouldn't compare physical space. That's different. But at the same time, there are the things we should, of course, this is still, the liberation of the one of the European, Eastern European republics from the, authoritarian regime, and first of all, impunity of the police. Because I also should explain that, of course, there is no, let's say, this geopolitical aspect that also surprises some of the Ukrainians. I've been also asked this question, but I should say, though internationally Euromaidan was named Euromaidan, for me, Euromaidan was lasting for 1 week. After the moment that students were beaten, the Maidan was about brutality. And that's exactly what I feel, talking to the laborers, talking to the people who are working in the different clans and industries, everywhere in the street. I do think that this violence was the trigger. So in this regard, because this protest is of course about the economy, all the protests are about, a lot of other issues, about state which is not functioning, about the government which is not delivering, but still the aspect of the police brutality is so critical. So there, and it's way more critical in Belarus than in the Ukrainian state. The point was that in Ukraine, it was the first time when the people were beaten on the street. In Belarus, there were cases when the people were beaten, there were people who were arrested, but you never had almost up to 7,000 people detained. And this is incredible number. It just really can't be compared to any other country, where within one, because then you multiply it for families, for, acquaintance. So, I mean, everybody whom I met in Belarus within the first 10 days of the protest knew somebody who had been either beaten or detained or suffered. So I do think this is very critical. We shouldn't compare the unfortunate point is, of course, the aggressiveness and the level of the brutality of the Belarusian security service and the police. It's really unprecedented, but it's exactly the reason why the protesters should be very disciplined and to show, they're peaceful. Because from the, what was for me striking as well, it's not a news that the Russian PR agents or spin doctors had arrived to Belarus. So since very, after maybe the first weeks, when it was already clear that the protests are very serious, they are a threat to the regime, it was clear that the messages from the regime were not exactly what I think were usual in Belarus. They were as if from the textbook, from the manual we've seen in Ukraine in 24 or 2014 from Russian spin doctors. This is the aim, to divide society, to create this kind of anti-protest, to use the lexic, to find this story about the, guys in the masks who are violent. And they are not there in Belarus, but it feels like the spin doctors somewhere from Moscow, still looking at their textbook, looking what was in Ukraine and what was maybe real in Ukraine and trying to use it. Yet I do think that there are a couple of things which are not there, which are different, and as well, some of the Westerners and also Ukrainians and other scholars see it as maybe as a weakness of the protest. But honestly, today in 2020, I do think that is the strength of the protest. The fact that the Belarus doesn't have the formal opposition, political opposition, that it was dismantled within the decades. Somehow in Ukraine, of course, the protest was very politicized, but because of that, it was possible to use for the propaganda, for the regime, as, you know, as the political game. And the fact that Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the fact that somebody say she's weak, she's not a politician, she's just, you know, she doesn't act as a politician, is actually her strength, because nobody can accuse her that she wants power. And that's the reason why people trust her. I really love this very, maybe, you know, nice metaphor, which one of my friends, Belarusian journalist from Belarus, said that, like, you know, like, I see it as if like in the Lord of the Rings, when she's like a Frodo who is bringing this this ring of power, and she's maybe not strong enough, but that's why she's capable to do that. She's not tempted by power herself, and that's why people trust her. So that's why, and I do think that is important. The fact that the West can't influence somehow, because in Ukraine, this point was that the West was still a player for Ukraine. Ukraine was economically dependent of the West, and with a good reason somehow. You know, unfortunately, Belarus was so much isolated, and the regime for many years done everything possible that the West doesn't have leverage. But at the same time, we understand that the regime depends on the strength of the regime. It's very much depends on the fact whether there would be defection from many, you know, people in the army, in the military, in the security service, on the high elite of the Belarusian political elite. So somehow the Belarusian they do need support from international community, from all of us. The solidarity is needed. But I'm in fact glad that the protest is not dependent that much. It's taking place on the ground, and it can be. So that somehow is a good thing. And therefore, I do think that there are things to compare, but not in the visual, you know, in the visual format. Of course, the interesting thing and the unique thing, which I still think is a very unique for Belarus, we can't compare to any other country. These are the strikes of the workers. The fact that the Belarus has preserved so many state enterprises. It was always said as a weakness, but at the same time, you know, the state is dependent. You know, state is not dependent on the private industries. So therefore, I think somehow it's a moment where the weakness could be used as a strength. And I know how difficult, and at this moment, what I still want you to compare, because unfortunately I want to be back to Belarus due to the other reasons. I can't stay, you know, longer, and I hope to be back. But I do remember the time when after 4 weeks in Kiev, and it was not just in Kiev, but other protests, journalists leave. You know, it feels like the protest is not that active. It feels like it may, you know, slow down. The international interest is going off. That's normal, but it doesn't mean it's over. We've been in the position where for a couple of weeks, it looked like at this moment, there is a stagnation, but the stagnation can be, you know, changed for something else. It's indeed a matter of time. So at this moment, I do want to compare that if for instance, you know, the leaders of the, I won't say these are not leaders of protest. These are not leaders of opposition. Yeah, I think that the people who are in the committee of the coordinators, I see that they are harassed. But you know, we also had the case when the people were kidnapped for some time. The loud voices were kidnapped. Then other voices come to the stage. And I also really like what we should do, compare that I also would probably encourage the Western colleagues, do not use the term opposition, because it's indeed, I don't think this is a protest of the opposition. What makes it also something that many protesters in many countries dreamt of, this is a really populist protest. It's like the people's protest, you know, because opposition, as many says, this is a minority which claims for the right to be heard, but it's indeed it's just the people. That would be my my take on this. And probably just one moment, let me say how it's better to speak in English. Belarus or Belarusian, just like let us fix it, because at this course of this talk I understood that, like, oh, what the word I should use in English.
Thank you. Thank you, Nataliya. I personally think that it has been Belarus and Belarusians long time ago, and it should be actually with one S as well, and A, and
Okay.
that's very important to ensure. So there is a birth of Belarusians, and they're known now. Okay, well, fantastic, absolutely fantastic conversation, but I think we're keeping now our audience a little bit kind of thirsty and waiting. Could I just, before we move into the Q&A, and of course, can I just say thank you to our speakers for this fantastic kind of initiation of discussion. But also, can I please encourage our audience, for those who are watching us on Zoom, please post your questions via Q&A or the chat. And those who are watching us on YouTube, please post them to Q&A, to chat, if possible, please. So we have quite a few questions now coming up, and I would like to invite perhaps the first one, who is from Anna Davidson from Oxford University. Please, Anna, pose your question now.
Hi, thank you, Elena. Hopefully you can hear me. But yeah, my question is really to all panelists. Thank you so much for your amazing talks. I was wondering, is there any consensus among the protesters in Belarus about what a non-Lukashenko government might look like? So is there any proactive consensus, proactive concepts of what a Belarusian government should be that is not Lukashenko, as opposed to, you know, the things that they don't want?
Okay, thank you. So I think because we're having people appearing with their questions, so let's answer the question first, because we have a queue of people then wanting to ask. So thank you very much, Anna. So whoever would like to go first.
I may start. I would say that the major consensus is about the return to the constitution, where the Belarus was the parliamentary republic, not a presidential one. So I think this is the people are really, it's the constitution of 1994. So there was the limitation on the presidential terms. So this is the major consensus. It was already in the program put by Tikhanovskaya, and people are still really tired of being this unended presidency, and this is the consensus that I observe that are very strong in the present. Maybe someone can add.
Well, I will just add that there is a consensus in terms of the demands, in a way, what should be done when Lukashenko is gone, and it came not from kind of, you know, top to down, but also workers, when they organized for strikes and they put up, like, this is our demands. The new fair election is the number one. So this should be done, and that's what Svetlana Tikhanovskaya promised. She promised, I will have this power to release the prisoners, including those who were planning to stand for presidency, and I will organize new fair election. So this is the demand number one, and then obviously the release of all political prisoners, and also bringing to justice the perpetrators of the state violence. So this is absolutely common concern, I think, kind of thinking across protesters now.
Okay, thank you. And if I were to add just a few words as well, very important question, because it's not only about mobilization, and now we've already talked about peoplehood, the idea of peoplehood, but it is also increasingly the way it is shaped, the local, bottom up. And I think the driving factor of it all is the idea, or a sense of a good life not in a material sense. And you can see why so many people took it to the streets, because they're not interested in material dimension of it all, but the idea of being just and free, I think that what drives people forward. And it is a very powerful factor that shapes people today. And this is something that will be developed further, because with all the other kind of values added to it, then a sense of good life, it clearly is moving people forward. Okay, thank you, Anna. We have then Anthony, please, with the question.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Indeed.
Yes, it seems that Lukashenko is adopting the classic tactics of divide and rule by picking off one opposition leader one by one. And do you think that's happening? And secondly, how effective, in terms of the opposition, how do you think they can mobilize themselves more effectively to form a sort of united front against Lukashenko? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Who would like to go first?
Can I say, I'm actually find the Belarusian activists extremely efficient, way more efficient than I've seen activists wherever, because usually the main issue of the activist is to make it national, make it broad, make it inclusive. So we usually see the activists trying to knock to their grannies, parents, other people, just like join us, you know, and you know, to show that it's about you. Here, I've seen that it's about you. You don't need it. The workers are there. The people are there. Efficiency in this case, it's really a lot about the self-discipline. What I'm concerned in every protest, and I think that was also the big tragedy of the Maidan, which in the end succeeded but paid a huge price, was the fact that the people were provoked. The people were kind of drawn into the violence. And in cases at the last point of the revolution in Ukraine, they didn't make it to stay away, you know, not to respond even if the regime is tough, even not to respond symbolically. So this efficiency is there, but I do think that the strikes is the key issue. The fact that to show that it's still there, a nationwide protest all over the country in the small towns, and probably the main tactics is exactly to make, you know, people on the higher level of the hierarchy, whether this is a school dean, or whether there's a university dean, or the head of the museum, or the you know, union leader, or for instance the head of at some kind of enterprise, at some of the industry. There is, for instance, not just an average worker, but his boss, not the top boss, but somebody there is joining the strikes, is joining the protest. And that's why bit by bit, these people on the top, the elite, should really understand that there is no way for them. So this is what can make the people efficient, usually make efficient. And I do think that so far the people in Belarus are like moving this direction genuinely, intuitively, you know, as if like, I mean, I've studied nonviolence, and like, I feel it's absolutely genuine, but it's really like they do what it's, you know, Gandhi said to do, what Martin Luther King was kind of calling people to do.
Okay, thank you, Nataliya. Nadzeya, please.
Very, very quick. I wanted to question the concept of efficiency as well, what we mean by efficient protest, because I think if at the end, you know, Lukashenko will be overthrown, everyone would say, wow, amazing, that has been very efficient. And also I think that they are efficient. I just wanted to echo what Nataliya said, because they respond, they are decentralized, and they respond to what the state tries to do in all the levels. They organize their coordination council, they organize in strikes, the student organize their thing, the lecturers at the university respond to the violence that was directed to the students, you know. So in a way, this fluidity, what, you know, or being as water, is very efficient. And a very quick comment on what Nataliya said about provoking the violence. I think in case of Belarus, the state violence of Belarus has been broadcasted so widely now for a month, for almost 35 days, that actually no response to that could be interpreted or read, you know, as disproportionate or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So this kind of self-reliance and self-organization is one of the most particular features of Belarus protests, as well as actually IT platforms that actually help people to self-organize and mobilize. I'm sure you're all familiar with Telegram. And it was amazing that my mother was reliant just on a word of mouth until my brother came and sort of set up the Telegram on her phone, and off she goes, self-organizes herself with her friends and goes to all these events in different parts of the city. So this is just most incredible. And that's what makes, I don't know whether it's modern protests or whether Belarus is particular in this sense, that this kind of bottom-up, self-organizing and self-reliant movement has actually far greater potential to stay for longer and to basically to be determinate and to be defiant and resistant. Okay, we have actually a queue. I'm sorry, I'm being conscious of time. Alena, do you want to add anything, or shall we move to the next question? Is quite interesting too. Simon, hello. Haven't seen you for a long time. Could you please come in with your question? Hi.
Hi. Hello, Elena, and thank you all. And my question's to Nadzeya. You mentioned the feminist content of the protests, and you spoke about these posters, which I've also seen some photographs, which are really fantastic. And I think this is very important. Could you say a bit more about how, two things. One, how it was articulated pre-election. I've heard people say that there was a real response to the women candidates speaking on television, and that changed things. And also, any thoughts about how this feminism could be practiced and articulated from here onwards? That's a big one, but maybe just some thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. Nadia, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Oh, thank you for a wonderful question. And yes, I think that what I was amazed when I was watching, you know, the Radio Svoboda, the Freedom Radio, was broadcasting always live when people were gathering for the meetings that Tikhanovskaya and Tsepkalo and Kolesnikova organized. And they were just asking people questions. And very often they would ask, how do you feel about that Svetlana Tikhanovskaya is a woman? You know, can you imagine the woman president? And I was surprised that most of the people, I mean, all people that I at least saw, they said like, men, I mean, they were like, yeah, we're absolutely fine with that. Like we are for gender equality. And I think that also shows something that, you know, this idea that post-Soviet states, all of them they are patriarchal, obviously. I mean, all our societies are patriarchal, let's face it, but in a way that they are so backward. Also, I think they defied it in a way. And obviously the way, I think the way how Svetlana and Veronica addressed and Maria addressed people as people, you know, on a very human level. Actually, maybe even, I think, I just also want to echo what Nataliya said, that they were like, oh, you know, Svetlana is not a real politician, but maybe this was her strength. She just didn't use this, you know, very vague political cliche. And I think it's also very interesting because I remember that when she mentioned that Svetlana said, you know, I just want to live a good life and go back to my husband, you know, and do the cooking. The Ukrainian feminists, some of them were offended, you know, and they said, oh, she's not a true feminist. And I thought, how interesting, because I think what happened, Svetlana, maybe she didn't sound like feminist, you know, but she redefined this concept. She just broadened it, which allowed more women to actually kind of, you know, be empowered. Maybe they don't call themselves feminists. Maybe, you know, feminism still is kind of a niche. But I think if we're talking about women and their role in the society, that has shifted, and that's irreversible in Belarus. I hope so. You know, and I think that the audience, in a way, of feminism or whatever, it just broadened the role of women, you know, as active, members of the society and protesters and people and citizens. It's acknowledged by women, by men, by all people. So I think in a way how it will be brought further, it's just a question of you know, whatever will happen, but I don't think that it will just disappear. I don't think so.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Great, thank you, Nadia. Thank you, Simon. We have a number of questions. One from Rafael Peroni, who's been patiently waiting, and also some questions from YouTube. So, Rafael, please, the floor is yours, but try to be concise because I'm just worried that we will not accommodate all the questions.
Okay,
Please.
sure, yes. I just have one question on Russia. Is that, you know, the role of Russia in the transition that's happening in Belarus, is that a real possibility, a real threat of, I don't know, invasion or interference? How do you see the role of Russia in what's happening now in Belarus?
Anyone? Thank you. Rafael? No?
No.
Oh, okay. I can probably, you know, because that's also what you know, what is largely discussed here in Ukraine. And I've like listened to the, you know, and one of the protesters was saying that like, oh, Russia won't invade Belarus because it's in Crimea somewhere. People maybe supported Russia. We here are not. But I do think that it's a different, of course, issue. When I do think why. There are two big motives for the Kremlin. First of all, of course, the success of the protests in Belarus is very bad for the Kremlin domestically, of course, because you know Ukraine is chaotic, so Georgia is chaotic, so the revolution there is possible, but it's impossible in a country like Belarus. It's a super strong signal for Russian citizens. So that would be the reason to believe that the Kremlin would be extremely active till the end to back Lukashenko. At the same time, you know, that when you read to the Russian experts, they would say that, you know, there were not the best relations between Putin and Lukashenko. And in the end, we do have the example of Armenia, where somehow there were democratic protests, there were democratic leader who, you know, outed the long-lasting, supported by the Kremlin, Serge Sargsyan, the people from this post-Soviet elite. At the same time, the international politics of the Armenia hadn't changed. So the democratic prime minister of Armenia still voting or abstain, or Armenia, you know, still let's say supporting, but support the annexation of Crimea. They are extremely cautious about their relations with Ukraine. So somehow there is this shows us the prospect that there is a way when it's possible that the Kremlin would let the protests go, but still knowing that any future leader of Belarus should be extremely pragmatic, because they're very dependent on the Kremlin, and they would be still dependent, you know, in this regard. That's why there is a reason where also many Ukrainians don't like, but all the public faces of the Belarusian protests, they always say that we are not against Russia. We are not against Russia as mantra. And even today, you know, Svetlana Alexievich still speaking about that. So I don't think this is about the annexation. It's something, maybe a different model. I would shortly answer your second question, which I read in the comments. I don't think there is any protest which would have real economic impact in the short term. You know, the protests can have the large economic impact after months and months, but it won't be visible for a very long time, because, you know, you still go on the street, you still, you know, work. So it's not something which can influence the protest at all. In fact, the economy, like in a way that people can feel it to stop.
Okay, that's fantastic. So in other words, it's a double-edged sword for Russia as well as for Belarus. We have a question from YouTube, which is kind of very much echoes what Rafael has asked. The question goes as follows. The revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine succeeded. but both countries lost territories to Russia. Can the protest in Belarus possibly succeed without Russia invading, in brackets, part of brackets, the country? Question mark. Nadzeya.
Yeah, I just want to support what Nataliya in a way said, and I just add that we have to think, I think that Putin or Russia or Kremlin, however frame it, are between stone and a hard place in a way, because we have to think about the cost of invading into another country, economical cost, but also symbolical in a way, you know, what it would cost. So the invasion is a very strong word. Influence is another matter. So I think that if that answers the question, I think to invade another country is a very expensive venture in a way.
And it's not only expensive, it is irrational at the moment for Russia, given everything that is going on there. And even under the CSTO provision, Russia can only move troops there if Belarus is under threat. If the threat is external, there is no external threat. And also we keep forgetting that there is also Budapest memorandum, but of course it kind of invalidated itself with Ukraine. So in other words, Russia has nothing, absolutely nothing, sorry, I have to emphasize it, to do with Belarus, so back off. Okay, the question here, shall we go to Mary Kalina, please? Very interesting question. Would Mary come to the video? If not, then I can just read it aloud. Oh, Mary's coming. Mary, you need to unmute yourself.
Hi, sorry, I thought you were going to read my question. Thank you very much. I'm calling from the United States, but I'm Ukrainian as well. Oops.
Hello.
Sorry.
Okay. Yeah,
Добрый день.
Добрый день.
So first of all, I just want to say thank you to you, the women of Belarus, because you're a great inspiration to us here in America who are fighting our own autocratic attempt, as you probably are aware. And you know, we have someone now who aspires to be a Lukashenko and among others. My question is, where do the police and other institutions stand now in relation to Lukashenko? Do you see any cracks? Do you see any splitting or possibility that they are not supporting him? I mean, I know in Ukraine an important moment was when the police declared that they were with the people. And do you see anything in this direction right now in Belarus?
Okay, thank you, Maria. Who would like to answer it? Alena, please.
Yeah, it's not. Fortunately, it's not on this snowball level now, so it's not very accelerating. But I've on Telegram that Elena already mentioned. This is channels, Nechta channels that are very popular. Some former policemen, they posted their resignation letters, and some ambassadors explicitly supported the protesters. So there are people who were employed by the state and who are also state journalists who openly supported the protesters and condemned the violence. And we hope that it will be just slowly, but with time, more people will find this courage. But yeah, but it's happening, and I think this is there is this sign that there is a movement into this direction.
Yeah, thank you. It just takes time, unfortunately. Nadzeya, do you have anything to add? We just have 2 more questions after that.
Yeah, very quickly, that the people are resigning from the police and from KGB and from other state institutions, and that they also take a picture of their resignation letters. But as Alena and Elena said, that's the long, like that's a process. So but there are signs of hope here as well.
But what I want to add that it's not about resignation of the police. I think in this type of the very, very brutal and criminal actions by the police, the point that they would have their feeling of unity, because if there is somebody guilty, they are. And we see it as well. It creates the feeling of the community among the security service, among the police. You know, if there is somebody to defect, they would be the last, in particular. So, because they are part of the regime, they would need the protection. Therefore, I do think that we do not need really looking forward for particularly them, because if that would be, they would be the last. We're speaking about maybe some political elite, the heads of the plans, and and a lot of other people. Because if we just look at this direction, these are the least chances, because it's like in many countries, in Ukraine, for instance, there is still very strong community of this Berkut riot police. They are still feel that they were attacked. They still, you know, because it's bounded like in the criminal gang, you know, they committed a crime together. So they would have their brotherhood of the people who committed the crime. So not everybody, not too many of them might resign, in particularly in this field, but there are the other fields where we have to look for the defection.
Yeah, I guess we're here for the long run, to be frank. Okay, thank you very much. We have one more question from anonymous attendee who asks about how long people can economically afford to continue protesting. And the next question is from Nataliya Cherneshova, who will ask it shortly. So, how long do you think we can afford, more to the point, can people afford economically to continue protesting?
It's a good question. I just wanted to say that people maybe know that there are funds that have been crowdfunded, and it's not even like hundreds, thousands, it's millions of euros that have been donated by also Belarusians abroad, IT community, supporters, and so on. So these funds also go to strikers, to workers, to those who have been affected economically, to those who lost their jobs because of, for example, they were explicitly against the regime or something. So I think that's also a very interesting level of self-organization, when actually Belarusians, and it's in a way it's not very expensive to live in Belarus. If you earn money somewhere in the US as an IT, you probably can donate. You know, you can support a family in Belarus. So I think that we have to at least take into account this as well, that there are money coming not from the states and salary as well to support people on the ground. The rest is maybe someone want to comment on the economic part of the problem.
I think we need to remember that these people, because it is precisely coming bottom up and it is all about self-organization, I think these people have passed the point of no return. They cannot go back to the previous normal. They need to find the new normal. And until they find the new normal, I think they will resist. And that's, I think, what is currently happening in Belarus. Okay, Nataliya, please come in. You had a question there. And I think with your question, we're probably coming to the finale. Please.
All right, well, thank you very much for hello, Elena. Good to see you. Thank you very much for organizing this and for speaking to us, all of you, and also particular thanks to people who were on the ground, because I know it takes a lot of courage to keep going. I want to bring my question and our discussion a little bit back to the question of this, you know, resolute peacefulness of the protest, almost a doggedly peaceful protest this is in the face of enormous provocation. And on the one hand, I know that this can be very powerful, this sense of righteousness, high moral ground. And I've seen this, I was fortunate, I guess, to observe a little bit of the first of the big marches on the first Sunday that they took place in Minsk. And I remember, you know, someone saying to me not to be a bottle inside. You know, people were so pure, as it were, in how they responded to enormous violence, you know, horrific brutality that you mentioned. And this has now lasted for well over 4 weeks, into the 5th week, in the face of the provocation that is mounting again, and we've seen this recently, you know, even with women not being immune against, you know, physical violence by this enormous, you know, masked, presumably policemen and so on. So my question, and I've also observed, or began to observe something on those Telegram channels that you also all mentioned, and that is that this wonderful and very novel for Belarus feeling and practice of self-organizing at a level of communities, districts, you know, neighborhoods. That's great, but it's I've seen some comments about self-organization in terms of defense, which will become, of course, a bit more physical. Defense against snatchings, kidnappings, and so on. And I guess my question is particularly to people who have observed the mood in Belarus most recently. Do you feel that there are changes in the public mood, in this insistence on continued peacefulness, which, as we've said, and I agree with a lot of what's been said, is very important for the protest. But is there a sense that, you know, there will be a point when people will just have had enough, and, you know, human instinct kicks in, and when you're being kicked, you will kick back. So I'd be very grateful for your views on that. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Nataliya. Very poignant question. So perhaps Alena, first, because obviously you were on the ground recently there.
That's a very responsible position now. Because I'm sort of feel like I'm responsible for, but I do believe that we will stay on our ground, being peaceful, and will resist any sort of provocation. But I mean, of course, I just cannot promise. I mean, cannot talk for any sort of, because, you know, you also know that some of cases that are now, some people now in prison for sort of, even Sergei Tikhanovsky, he didn't sort of do anything, but the policemen were lying on the ground, and then he was guilty of kicking him, but it was, even the camera shows that it was not really an attack. So what I was saying, like, you can, it's such a sensitive question,
like never say never. Yeah,
yeah, and also
difficult.
how you defense and then the attack. It's also the question of interpretation, how you defend yourself, and when it's already more than a defense. That's why I'm so hesitant to give a certain answer, because I just really don't know. But what I sense is I really believe that we are continue peacefully.
I just wonder whether thank you, Elena, any parallels, because Nataliya mentioned that, you know, the first 3 months of the Maidan, they were very much peaceful. So what was the turning point?
For us, the turning point was the moment when the government has forbidden everything, where actually was the law adopted by the parliament, where everything was illegal. You know, we called it the dictatorship law. At that moment, you know, like writing on Facebook was illegal, being on the street was illegal, and that was somehow a moment when you thought, like, okay, if everything is illegal, then also like using cocktail molotovs. I mean, I would have the same punishment for writing on Facebook, for being on the street. It just was broken last resort, because nothing worked. Neither the parliament, neither the courts. Yet I do still, you know, following the other protests globally, I should say that the more brutal police is, the more peaceful people should be. Because, you know, the point that why Ukrainian protests also were, you know, let's say in the end, violent, because Ukrainian police actually was not, you know, in a way the people didn't understand that they can act, that they would shoot. They couldn't expect that. Somehow police in Belarus showed they can do anything. So in a way, I in fact somehow appreciated the fact that after so many years of KGB and everything, people in Belarus are cautious of provocateurs. They know that they are existing. They know that the KGB is everywhere. So they should be double cautious. And the people who are somehow among the crowd saying like, let's go there when it's dark, people really understand that might be something wrong about that. So I do think that also this years of dictatorship somehow also learn people to be cautious, and that's what I only thing wish to the protesters, even as a journalist, as a human, that indeed that's now how regimes try to, they really try to do that, not by police, but by having the people inside the crowds, just really provoking the people.
I think we've lost Nataliya just for a moment. Anyway, I think, yeah, hopefully the peaceful mood will continue, because that's where, the higher moral ground still prevail. And that's what actually Belarus is all about, and those who voted for change. I think we're now well past the time given to us. And I'll now give the floor to Alena, who organized it all, for the final words. And I thank you all the speakers and also the audience for most insightful questions. Thank you.